An elderly farmer living in the vast Texas countryside stumbles upon a young woman unconscious on his property. What happens next will leave you speechless. The decisions he makes will challenge everything you believe about humanity. Stay tuned to uncover the truth behind this shocking encounter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps us going. Henry Williams, a 68-year-old farmer, had lived his entire life in the same quiet corner of rural Texas. His farm was modest but well kept, a place where every tool, every fence post, and every acre told a story of hard work and dedication. Henry was a man of habit, starting each day with a cup of coffee on the creaky porch of his wooden farmhouse, gazing out over his land as the sun began to rise. His daily routine was a source of comfort and predictability. On one particular morning, Henry felt the urge to take a longer walk around his property. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue unmarred by clouds, and a light breeze carried the scent of fresh hay. Henry grabbed his hat, slung his cane over his arm just in case his bad knee acted up, and set off toward the fields. The quiet hum of nature surrounded him. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at a rabbit or squirrel scurrying away. As Henry approached the farthest corner of his land, a patch of overgrown grass and wildflowers near an old hay barn, something unusual caught his eye. A figure lay motionless on a stack of hay just inside the barn, half hidden by the shadows. Henry froze, gripping his cane tightly. At first, he thought it might be one of the local teenagers playing a prank, or perhaps a drifter seeking shelter. But as he moved closer, the figure became clearer. A young woman, frail and unkempt, her dark skin smudged with dirt, her clothes tattered and ill-fitting. She looked as though she hadn't eaten in days. Henry's heart sank. "Miss?" he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet barn. She didn't stir. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the scattered hay on the ground. Kneeling beside her, Henry reached out a trembling hand to check for a pulse at her neck. Relief flooded through him when he felt the faint but steady beat beneath his fingers. Her face was pale beneath the layer of grime, and her breathing was shallow. She looked like she had been through something terrible, though what, Henry couldn't begin to guess. One thing was clear: she needed help, and fast. Henry glanced around the barn, hoping to find some clue about who she was or how she had ended up here. There was nothing. Just the old wooden walls and the dusty remains of hay bales that hadn't been used in years. Taking a deep breath, he made up his mind. He couldn't leave her here. With great effort, Henry lifted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost worryingly so. His joints protested under the strain, but he tightened his grip and began the slow trek back toward the farmhouse. Each step was a struggle, the uneven ground making the journey even harder. As he walked, Henry tried to push back the questions swirling in his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why had she ended up here on his land in such a desperate state? The answers would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. Henry's path took him through the heart of his farm, past fields of golden wheat and grazing cattle. His animals watched curiously as he passed, their soft, lowing the only sound besides the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. His breathing grew heavier, and he paused to adjust his grip on the woman, his arms aching under the strain. By the time Henry reached the farmhouse, sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. He carefully laid the woman on an old wicker couch on the porch, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Then he stepped inside to call the nearest clinic, explaining the situation as briefly as he could. "The woman needs medical attention," Henry insisted when the receptionist hesitated. "She's in bad shape. Please send someone out here." It took some convincing, but eventually the clinic agreed to dispatch an ambulance. Henry returned to the porch and sat beside the unconscious woman, watching over her as they waited. He couldn't help but feel a pang of protectiveness. Whoever she was now his responsibility, at least until the professionals arrived. When the ambulance finally pulled into the driveway, 2 paramedics jumped out and began assessing the woman's condition. Henry stepped back to give them room, his hands trembling slightly as he watched them work. Within minutes, they had her secured on a stretcher and loaded into the vehicle. "Will she be all right?" Henry asked one of the paramedics, his voice laced with worry. "D. She's malnourished and dehydrated, but she's alive. We'll do everything we can." Henry nodded, though the uncertainty in the man's tone left him uneasy. As the ambulance disappeared down the dusty road, Henry stood alone on his porch, the morning sun now high in the sky. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that she was in capable hands, but also a lingering sense of responsibility. Whoever this young woman was, her story was now entwined with his, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Henry Williams had never thought of himself as a hero. He was a simple man with simple routines, and the weight of responsibility had always felt natural on his shoulders. But as he adjusted the unconscious woman in his arms and began the long trek toward the clinic, he felt a sense of urgency unlike anything he'd experienced in years. The dusty Texas road stretched before him, its uneven surface a challenge to navigate even on the best of days. The morning sun had climbed higher, bathing the land in a golden glow, but its heat was beginning to press down like a heavy blanket. Henry's old boots kicked up small clouds of dirt with each step, and the creak of his joints was a reminder of his advancing years. The woman in his arms stirred faintly, but didn't wake. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath shallow and warm against his neck. Her condition was dire. Her frailty spoke of days, maybe weeks, without proper care. Henry adjusted his grip, his muscles already aching under her weight, and set his jaw with determination. "This is nothing," he muttered to himself, his voice gruff. "Just a little farther." The journey was slow and grueling. Each step seemed to stretch into eternity as Henry navigated the winding path leading from his farm to the nearest town. His thoughts raced, filled with questions he couldn't yet answer. Who was this woman? What had happened to her? And why had she ended up on his farm of all places? The first signs of the town appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings silhouetted against the bright sky. Henry's heart lifted at the sight, though the distance between him and his destination still felt insurmountable. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his arms trembled with the effort of holding the woman steady. As he trudged onward, Henry passed a handful of other farmsteads. A few people paused their work to watch him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and indifference. One man, a burly farmer named Clyde, leaned against his truck and called out, "Hey, Henry, what's all this about?" Clyde's voice carried a hint of amusement, but his gaze lingered on the woman in Henry's arms. "Found her on my property," Henry replied without breaking stride. His tone was curt, leaving no room for further questions. Clyde shrugged and turned back to his work, clearly uninterested in getting involved. The indifference of his neighbors didn't surprise Henry, but it stung all the same. He was used to the self-reliant nature of the community, where everyone looked after their own and rarely meddled in the affairs of others. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was different. This woman needed help, and if no one else would step forward, then he would. The road grew steeper as Henry approached the outskirts of town. His breathing was labored now, each inhalation sharp and shallow. He paused briefly to adjust his hold on the woman, her limp form a dead weight against his chest. His legs ached, his back throbbed, but he refused to stop. The clinic was close. He could see its white facade shining in the distance like a beacon. As he pressed on, a car approached from behind, its tires crunching over the gravel road. Henry turned slightly, hoping the driver might offer assistance. The car slowed as it drew near, and the driver, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, rolled down her window. "Need a hand there, Henry?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Henry hesitated. His pride warred with his exhaustion, but the woman in his arms was growing heavier by the second. "If you're headed toward the clinic, I could use a lift." The woman glanced at the figure in Henry's arms and frowned slightly. "Clinic's not on my way, but good luck to you." With that, she rolled up her window and drove off, leaving Henry standing in a cloud of dust. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, shifting the woman's weight once more. "Guess it's up to me." The last stretch of the journey was the hardest. The clinic was now in sight, its modest building nestled among a cluster of small shops and houses. Henry's steps grew slower, his body protesting every movement, but the thought of giving up never crossed his mind. He focused on the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the dirt, using it as a distraction from the burning in his muscles. When he finally reached the clinic's front steps, Henry was nearly at his limit. He carefully set the woman down on a wooden bench near the entrance, leaning heavily against the wall to catch his breath. His vision swam for a moment, but he steadied himself with a deep breath and straightened up. Pushing open the clinic door, he was greeted by a young receptionist who looked up from her desk with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Can I help you?" "There's a woman outside," Henry said, his voice hoarse from the effort of speaking. "She's unconscious, needs medical attention." The receptionist's eyes widened, and she quickly motioned for a nurse. Within moments, a flurry of activity ensued as the medical staff hurried outside to assess the situation. Henry watched as they carefully lifted the woman onto a stretcher and carried her inside, their efficiency a sharp contrast to his slow, painstaking journey. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked one of the nurses, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "We'll do everything we can," the nurse replied, her tone reassuring but non-committal. Henry nodded, though the uncertainty in her words left him uneasy. As the clinic doors closed behind the stretcher, he sank onto the bench, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion he'd been holding at bay. The sun was high in the sky now, its heat oppressive, but Henry felt a strange sense of relief. The woman was in good hands, and his part in her story, at least for now, was over. But, as he sat there, catching his breath and watching the world go by, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger than himself. The clinic was quiet, its air heavy with the scent of antiseptics and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Henry Williams sat stiffly in the corner of the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together. The worn fabric of the chair beneath him creaked as he shifted his weight. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but inside the clinic, the cool air felt almost oppressive. It had been over an hour since the medical staff had taken the unconscious woman away, and Henry's thoughts were a storm of worry and questions. He replayed the morning over and over in his mind. The moment he'd found her on the haystack, the long walk to the clinic, and the indifferent stares of the townspeople. Every detail seemed to etch itself into his memory. He glanced up as a nurse entered the waiting room, her clipboard held tightly against her chest. Her expression was neutral but professional, a practiced mask that gave little away. Henry stood abruptly, his heart pounding. "Is she all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. The nurse hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the paper in front of her before meeting Henry's gaze. "She's stable for now, severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from exhaustion. We've given her fluids and started some tests to better understand her condition." Henry nodded, a small measure of relief washing over him. "That's good. That's real good. Thank you." "Are you family?" the nurse asked, her tone careful. "No," Henry admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "I just found her. She was on my property, and she didn't look like she could make it on her own." The nurse's expression softened slightly. "That was kind of you. Not everyone would have done the same." Henry shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just did what needed doing. Before the conversation could continue, the clinic's receptionist approached, her eyes darting nervously between Henry and the nurse. She whispered something too low for Henry to hear, but the way the nurse's face hardened set him on edge. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. The nurse hesitated again, clearly deliberating how much to say. "There's been some concern raised about the situation." "What kind of concern?" Henry pressed, his tone defensive now. The receptionist stepped forward, her voice cautious. "It's just unusual, Mr. Williams. A man like you bringing in a woman like her, in her condition. Some of the staff were curious." Henry stiffened, his weathered face darkening with frustration. He knew exactly what they meant, but didn't want to dignify their insinuation with a response. "I told you, I found her on my property. That's the whole story. She needed help, and I brought her here. End of it." The nurse nodded quickly, sensing the tension. "Of course. It's just protocol to ask questions in cases like this. Thank you for your cooperation." Henry grumbled something under his breath and sank back into the chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hated being questioned like this, especially when he knew he'd done the right thing. But he also understood how it might look to people who didn't know him. A white farmer carrying an unconscious black woman into a clinic. People were bound to jump to conclusions. As the hours dragged on, Henry's frustration began to fade, replaced by a gnawing worry for the woman's condition. He found himself pacing the small waiting room, his boots scuffing against the tiled floor. Every so often, he would glance toward the hallway, hoping for some kind of update. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, a doctor emerged from the hallway. He was a tall man with graying hair and a weary expression, his white coat slightly wrinkled. Henry stopped pacing and turned to face him, his heart racing. "How is she?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "She's improving," the doctor replied, offering a faint smile. "We've stabilized her condition and she's responding well to treatment. She hasn't regained full consciousness yet, but she's murmured a few words." Henry's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Words? Did she say anything important?" The doctor shook his head. "Nothing coherent, I'm afraid. Likely just fragments of memory or dreams. But it's a good sign that she's trying to communicate." Henry nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. That's good. Real good. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in his hands. We still have a lot of unanswered questions, Mr. Williams. Do you know her name? Where she might have come from? Henry shook his head. No idea. She was just there, on my haystack. Looked like she'd been through hell. The doctor sighed, his expression thoughtful. It's possible she's a transient or someone trying to escape a bad situation. Unfortunately, without more information, it's hard to piece together her story. Henry frowned, his mind racing with possibilities. Whoever this woman was, she'd clearly been through something terrible. And while he didn't know her story, he felt a growing sense of responsibility to see it through. Can I see her? He asked finally, his voice hesitant. The doctor considered this for a moment before nodding. Briefly. She's still very weak, but I think it might do her some good to know she's not alone. Henry followed the doctor down the hallway, his boots echoing softly against the tiled floor. The room they entered was small and sterile, with a single bed and a large window that let in the fading light of the day. The woman lay motionless on the bed, her dark skin contrasting sharply with the white sheets. An IV line was taped to her arm, and her breathing was steady but shallow. Henry approached the bed slowly, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He studied her face, which was now clean of the grime that had obscured it earlier. She looked young, mid-20s maybe, and despite her fragile state, there was a quiet strength in her features. Hang in there, miss, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. You're safe now. Just hang in there. For a moment, he thought he saw her eyelids flutter, but it was so faint he couldn't be sure. He lingered for a while longer, the silence of the room pressing down on him like a weight. Eventually, the doctor returned and gently ushered him out, promising to keep him updated. As Henry stepped back into the evening air, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The woman was alive and in good hands, but her story was far from over, and somehow he knew that his part in it wasn't over either. The next morning, Henry woke before dawn, his sleep fitful and filled with fragmented dreams of the woman he had carried to the clinic. As he prepared for his day, the thought of her recovery occupied his mind, and by the time the sun had fully risen, he was already on his way back to town. His old truck rattled along the uneven dirt road, dust rising in its wake as he approached the clinic. When Henry stepped into the waiting room, the receptionist from the previous day greeted him with a polite nod, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. He didn't pay it much mind. His focus was on the young woman. She's awake now, the receptionist said, gesturing toward the hallway. Room 3. The doctor said you can visit. Henry nodded his thanks and made his way down the quiet corridor, his boots clicking softly against the tile. The thought of seeing her awake filled him with equal parts relief and apprehension. What would she say? Would she even remember anything? When he pushed open the door to room 3, he found her sitting up in bed. She looked more alert than before, though her frailty was still evident in the gauntness of her cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. Her hair, now clean and combed back, framed her face, revealing striking features that seemed hardened by life, yet softened by her current vulnerability. Her eyes flicked toward Henry, and for a moment they stared at each other in silence. "Morning," Henry said, his voice gruff but gentle. He stepped further into the room, holding his hat in his hands. "Morning," she replied, her voice faint but steady. Her eyes studied him, cautious but not unfriendly. "You're the one who found me?" Henry nodded, settling into the chair by her bedside. "That's right. Found you out on my haystack, out cold. You gave me quite a scare." She let out a small, dry chuckle, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Guess I should be thanking you then." "Don't mention it," Henry said, waving off her gratitude. "Just glad you're all right." For a while, neither of them spoke. Henry wasn't sure how to proceed, and the woman seemed content to gather her thoughts. Finally, she broke the silence. "My name's Amanda," she said, her voice firmer now. "Amanda Johnson." Henry nodded. "Good to meet you, Amanda. I'm Henry Williams. This here's my farm country, just outside of town." Amanda's brow furrowed as she processed this. "Your farm? That's where I was?" "That's right," Henry confirmed. "Don't suppose you remember how you got there?" Amanda shook her head slowly, frustration flickering across her face. "No. Last thing I remember, I was walking, trying to get away from something. Someone, maybe. Everything after that is just blank." Henry studied her closely. Her words carried an undercurrent of fear, though she seemed to be doing her best to keep it hidden. He didn't press her for details. He figured she'd share more when she was ready. "Well, you're safe now," he said simply. "Clinic's taking good care of you." Amanda nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "You didn't have to help me, you know. A lot of people wouldn't have." Henry shrugged, his weathered face unreadable. "Didn't seem right to just leave you there." Amanda's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Williams." "Henry," he corrected. "Mr. Williams makes me sound older than I already feel." That earned a faint laugh from Amanda, and the tension in the room eased a fraction. For the next hour, they talked in fits and starts. Amanda was hesitant to share too much, and Henry didn't push her, but he learned enough to piece together a rough outline of her story. She had come to Texas a few weeks ago, hoping to leave behind a life of hardship and start fresh. She didn't go into specifics, but Henry could tell from the way she avoided his gaze that it hadn't been easy for her. Somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. She'd run out of money, run out of options, and found herself lost and alone. "You've been through a lot," Henry said quietly when she finished speaking. Amanda nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. "Yeah, but I'm still here." Henry's respect for her grew in that moment. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that reminded him of the tough, no-nonsense women he'd known growing up. She might be down, but she wasn't out, not by a long shot. As the conversation wound down, the doctor entered the room, his expression neutral but observant. He greeted Henry with a nod before turning his attention to Amanda. "How are you feeling today?" he asked. "Better," Amanda replied. "Tired, but better." "That's good to hear," the doctor said, making a note on his clipboard. "You're recovering well, but you'll need to stay here for a few more days to regain your strength." Amanda nodded, though her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she wasn't thrilled about the idea, but she didn't argue. The doctor glanced at Henry. "She's lucky you found her when you did. Another day or two out there, and it could have been a very different story." Henry said nothing, his jaw tightening at the thought. Amanda, however, gave him a grateful look that spoke volumes. After the doctor left, Amanda turned to Henry. "You've done more than enough for me already, but could you visit again? I mean, if it's not too much trouble." Henry's lips twitched into a small smile. "Not too much trouble at all. I'll be back." Amanda's smile in return was faint but genuine, and as Henry left the clinic he felt a strange sense of purpose settling over him. This wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. He'd been drawn into Amanda's story, and he wasn't about to walk away. The drive back to the farm was uneventful, the truck's steady rumble a comforting backdrop to Henry's thoughts. Amanda's resilience and determination had left an impression on him, and as he pulled into the familiar driveway, he found himself looking forward to seeing her again. For the first time in years, Henry felt like he was part of something larger than himself. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done helping Amanda yet. The days following Amanda's awakening settled into a rhythm. Each morning, after tending to his chores on the farm, Henry made his way to the clinic. The 20-minute drive became a part of his routine, his old truck kicking up dust on the back roads as he thought about the conversations he and Amanda would share. Amanda was regaining her strength slowly, though the toll of her ordeal was still evident in her slender frame and tired eyes. Every day she seemed a little more present, a little more willing to share fragments of her story. And every day, Henry found himself drawn deeper into her world, his initial sense of duty evolving into something more personal. When Henry arrived at the clinic that morning, he carried a small paper bag filled with fresh peaches from his orchard, a rare indulgence for him, but one he thought Amanda might appreciate. The receptionist greeted him with a nod, having grown used to his daily visits, and waved him toward Amanda's room. She was sitting up in bed when he entered, her face brightening at the sight of him. "Morning, Henry," she said, her voice stronger than it had been days before. "Morning," Henry replied, setting the bag on the small table beside her bed. "Brought you something, fresh from my farm." Amanda peeked into the bag, her smile widening as she pulled out a peach. "This looks amazing." "Thank you." Henry shrugged, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "Figured you could use a bit of fresh air and sunshine, even if it's just in the form of a peach." Amanda laughed softly, taking a careful bite. The sweetness of the fruit seemed to revive her further, and for a moment they sat in companionable silence. Henry watched as she savored the peach, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Feels like it's been forever since I've had something this good," Amanda said, setting the peach down after a few bites. She wiped her hands on a napkin and turned her attention back to Henry. "You're spoiling me, you know." "Not every day I get company like this," Henry said with a small smile. "Figure I ought to make the most of it." Amanda chuckled again, though her laughter faded as her expression grew more serious. She leaned back against the pillows, her gaze distant. "You've been so kind to me, Henry, and I don't even know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Henry said firmly. "Sometimes folks just need a little help. Ain't nothing more to it than that." Amanda looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "It's just, people haven't always been so kind, especially not to someone like me." Henry's brow furrowed. "Someone like you? A black woman, alone in a place like this?" Amanda said bluntly, though there was no anger in her tone, just a quiet acceptance. "You've seen the way people look at me." Henry thought back to the suspicious glances he'd seen at the clinic, the whispered comments he'd overheard but ignored. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've seen it. But not everyone's like that, Amanda, least of all me." Amanda's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained guarded. I know that now, but it's hard to shake the feeling that people are just waiting for me to mess up, to prove their assumptions right. Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're tougher than most folks I know, and if they can't see that, it's their loss. Amanda studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. You remind me of my grandfather, she said suddenly. He was always straight-talking, didn't sugarcoat things, but he cared. You could feel it in the way he treated people. Henry smiled at the comparison, a flicker of pride warming his chest. Sounds like a good man. He was, Amanda said, her voice tinged with sadness. Lost him a few years back. He'd have liked you, I think. Well, I'd have liked him too, Henry said, his tone light but sincere. Anyone who raised someone as strong as you must have been one hell of a man. Amanda's smile widened, and for the first time Henry saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. A sign that she was starting to believe in herself again. The rest of their conversation was lighter, filled with stories of Henry's life on the farm and Amanda's childhood memories of her grandfather's garden. They laughed over Henry's clumsy attempts at baking and Amanda's tales of sneaking peaches from her neighbor's tree as a kid. The bond between them grew stronger with each shared moment, the barriers of age, race, and circumstance fading in the face of their mutual respect and understanding. As the morning stretched into afternoon, a nurse entered to check on Amanda, interrupting their conversation. Henry took the opportunity to excuse himself, promising to return the next day. You better, Amanda said, her tone teasing but warm. I'll be expecting more peaches. Henry chuckled. I'll see what I can do. As he left the clinic, Henry felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. Amanda wasn't just someone he had helped. She was someone who had become a part of his life, someone who had reminded him of the importance of connection and compassion. And though her road to recovery was far from over, Henry was determined to walk it with her, one step at a time. Amanda stood on the porch of Henry's farmhouse, her hands resting on the wooden railing as she gazed out over the vast expanse of the farm. The Texas sun was warm on her skin, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of hay and wildflowers. It was a far cry from the sterile walls of the clinic where she had spent the last few weeks. This place, with its open skies and rolling fields, felt like a new beginning. Henry emerged from the barn, his steps slow but purposeful as he approached. His broad-brimmed hat shaded his weathered face, and his plaid shirt was dusted with bits of straw. Amanda turned as he climbed the steps, her lips curving into a smile. "Mornin'," she greeted him. "Mornin'," Henry replied, tipping his hat. "You're up early?" Amanda shrugged, her smile widening. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd take in the view." Henry nodded, his gaze following hers across the fields. "It's a good view. Best time of day, if you ask me." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the farm filling the air. A rooster crowed in the distance, and the soft lowing of cows mingled with the rustle of leaves. Amanda breathed it all in, letting the peace of the moment settle over her. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. Henry glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "For what?" "For everything," Amanda said, turning to face him fully. "For finding me, for taking me to the clinic, for coming back every day, and for bringing me here. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Henry waved a hand dismissively. "Ain't nothing to repay, just did what anyone ought to do." Amanda shook her head, her eyes soft but serious. Not everyone would have done what you did, Henry. You didn't just help me. You gave me a second chance." Henry met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "Well, let's make that second chance count then." Amanda chuckled softly, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She had been staying at Henry's farm for a week now, gradually easing into the rhythms of rural life. At first, she had been hesitant, unsure of her place here. But Henry's quiet patience and unwavering kindness had made it easier. The townspeople, however, were a different matter. Word of Amanda's arrival had spread quickly, and while some had welcomed her with cautious smiles, others had been less friendly. The whispers and sideways glances were hard to ignore, but Amanda refused to let them drag her down. She was determined to build a life here, to prove to herself and to others that she belonged. "I was thinking," Amanda began, her voice hesitant, "maybe I could help out around the farm. You've already done so much for me, and I want to pull my weight." Henry looked at her, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You sure about that? Farming ain't exactly easy work." "I'm sure," Amanda said firmly. "I'm tougher than I look." Henry chuckled, nodding. "All right then, let's see what you've got." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Amanda threw herself into the work with a determination that impressed even Henry. She learned to milk cows, feed the chickens, and tend to the vegetable garden. Her hands grew calloused from the labor, but she found a strange satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for a long time. Henry watched her progress with a mixture of pride and quiet amusement. She had a knack for learning quickly, and her enthusiasm was contagious. Together, they fell into a comfortable routine, their days filled with work and their evenings spent on the porch, sharing stories and laughter. One evening, as they sat watching the sun dip below the horizon, Amanda turned to Henry with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about staying," she said softly. Henry glanced at her, his brow lifting. "Staying? In the town," Amanda clarified. "I mean, I love it here, but I think I need to put down roots. Find a job, make a life for myself." Henry nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good idea. You've got the grit for it, no doubt about that. Just don't let the townsfolk get to you. They can be set in their ways, but they'll come around." Amanda smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Henry, for believing in me." "Always," Henry said simply, tipping his hat. A week later, Amanda secured a job at the local diner. The owner, a kindly woman named Margaret, had been one of the few townspeople to welcome her with open arms. Amanda threw herself into the work with the same determination she had shown on the farm, quickly earning the respect of her co-workers and regular customers. Her presence in the community began to shift perceptions. The whispers and stares didn't disappear overnight, but they grew quieter as people saw Amanda for who she was, a hard worker, a kind soul, and a survivor. She began to make friends, building connections that made the town feel less like a place she had stumbled into and more like a home. Henry watched her progress with pride, though he missed her presence on the farm. They still saw each other often, sharing meals and catching up on each other's lives. Their bond, forged in the crucible of hardship, remained unshakable. As Amanda's life flourished, so did her sense of purpose. She started volunteering at the community center, helping organize events and offering support to others who were struggling. Her resilience and kindness inspired those around her, and she became a beacon of hope in the small town. One day, As she walked through the town square, she overheard a conversation between two older men sitting on a bench. They didn't notice her, too engrossed in their discussion. "That Amanda Johnson," one of them said, shaking his head. "She's got more backbone than most folks around here." "Henry sure found a good one," the other replied. "I reckon we could all learn a thing or two from her." Amanda smiled to herself, her heart swelling with pride. She had come a long way from the broken woman who had collapsed on Henry's haystack, and while the journey hadn't been easy, it had been worth every step. That evening, she returned to the farm to share dinner with Henry. As they sat on the porch, the stars shining above them, Amanda raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice steady and full of hope. "To new beginnings," Henry echoed, his eyes shining with quiet pride. Henry's farm buzzed with the sounds of life and renewal. The rows of vegetables flourished under Amanda's care. The chickens clucked contentedly in their coop, and the cows ambled lazily in the pasture. The farm had always been Henry's sanctuary, but now it felt like something more, an emblem of growth and change, much like the journey Amanda had taken since that fateful day he found her on the haystack. Amanda arrived early that morning, balancing a basket of fresh eggs on one hip and a loaf of bread from the local bakery in her other hand. She greeted Henry with a warm smile as he worked on repairing the barn door. He nodded in acknowledgement, tipping his hat briefly before turning back to his task. "Mornin', Henry," Amanda called out as she set the basket down on the porch. "Thought I'd bring breakfast." "Mornin'," he replied, his tone gruff but friendly. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Amanda said, brushing dust off her hands. "It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me." Henry paused his work, straightening up to look at her. "You've already done more than enough, Amanda. This farm's better off now than it's been in years, thanks to you." Amanda smiled, warmth filling her chest. Compliments from Henry were rare, but always genuine. She joined him at the barn, leaning against the doorframe as he resumed hammering. "I've been thinking," Amanda began, her tone tentative. Henry grunted softly in acknowledgement, his focus still on the door. "I want to make this farm part of the community again," she continued. "Host events, maybe start a market stand. People are starting to see this place as more than just your patch of land, and I think we could build on that." Henry paused, lowering his hammer as he turned to face her. "You think people would go for that?" "I do," Amanda said confidently. "I've talked to folks in town, and they love the idea. Besides, this place has so much to offer. It's more than just a farm. It's a symbol of what can happen when people come together." Henry rubbed his chin thoughtfully, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You've got big ideas, Amanda." "Only because you showed me what's possible," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "This place gave me a second chance. I want to share that with others." Henry nodded slowly, his smile growing. "All right then, let's do it." Over the next few weeks, Amanda and Henry worked tirelessly to bring her vision to life. They cleaned up the barn, repaired fences, and set up an area for visitors to gather. Amanda organized the first event, a harvest celebration featuring fresh produce, baked goods, and live music from local musicians. She even convinced Margaret, the owner of the diner, to cater the event. When the day of the celebration arrived, the farm was alive with activity. Families strolled through the fields. Children laughed as they chased each other around the chicken coop, and neighbors gathered to sample the fruits of Henry and Amanda's labor. The air was filled with the scent of baked bread and roasted corn, mingling with the sounds of music and conversation. Henry watched it all from the porch, his heart swelling with pride. For years, the farm had been his refuge, a place of solitude and quiet. Now it was something more, a gathering place, a hub of life and connection. And it was all thanks to Amanda. She joined him on the porch, her face glowing with satisfaction. "Looks like it's a success," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "Looks like," Henry agreed, his voice thick with emotion. They sat together in companionable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in a golden glow. The celebration continued into the evening, lanterns casting warm light over the gathering as laughter and music filled the air. As the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Amanda and Henry remained on the porch, savoring the quiet after the bustle of the day. Amanda turned to Henry, her expression thoughtful. "Henry," she began, her voice soft, "thank you for everything." Henry met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "No need to thank me, Amanda. You've done just as much for me as I've done for you." Amanda smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat in silence for a while longer, the bond between them unspoken but deeply felt. The farm had brought them together, and it had transformed them both in ways they couldn't have imagined. As the stars came out, Amanda rose to her feet, stretching. "I should head home. Early start tomorrow." Henry nodded, watching as she made her way to her car. "See you in the morning." "See you in the morning," Amanda echoed, her smile lingering as she drove away. Henry remained on the porch long after she left, the night air cool against his skin. He thought about everything they had accomplished together. The farm, the community, the connection they had built. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the farm's legacy was in good hands. And as he gazed out over the moonlit fields, he realized that this wasn't just a new beginning for Amanda. It was a new beginning for him, too. Amanda awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through her window. The small house she had rented near the town square was modest but cozy, a place she could finally call her own. After months of recovery and integration into the community, this space felt like a symbol of everything she had worked to rebuild. She stretched, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was still early, but she was used to waking with the sun, a habit she had picked up during her time on Henry's farm. As she dressed, her mind lingered on the upcoming day. The farm's harvest market was set to open for the first time, a culmination of weeks of preparation. What had started as a simple idea had blossomed into something much larger thanks to the collaboration of the town and Henry's unshakable support. Amanda felt a sense of pride and anticipation bubbling within her as she pulled on her boots and grabbed her bag. The town square was already alive with activity by the time Amanda arrived. Vendors were setting up stalls, arranging baskets of fresh produce, jars of homemade preserves, and handcrafted goods. Children darted between the booths, their laughter filling the air. The scene was vibrant, a testament to the hard work and determination of the people who had come together to make it happen. Amanda's booth was near the center of the market, a simple wooden table adorned with a colorful cloth and an assortment of goods from Henry's farm. Fresh peaches, jars of honey, and bunches of herbs were neatly arranged, drawing the attention of passers-by. Amanda worked quickly to set everything up, her movements practiced and efficient. "Looks like you've got quite the crowd already," came a familiar voice. Amanda turned to see Henry approaching, his hat tilted back and a rare smile on his weathered face. He carried a crate of freshly picked apples, which he set down beside the booth. "It's all thanks to you," Amanda replied, returning his smile. "This wouldn't have happened without your farm." Henry waved her words away. "You're the one who made it happen. I just provided the goods." Amanda laughed softly, adjusting a basket of peaches. "Well, either way, I couldn't have done it without you." As the morning wore on, the market grew busier. Customers crowded around Amanda's booth, drawn by the quality of Henry's produce and Amanda's warm demeanor. She greeted each person with a smile, answering questions about the farm and sharing recipes for the peaches and herbs. Henry watched from a distance, leaning against a nearby post as he took in the scene. He had always been content to work quietly in the background, but seeing Amanda thrive brought a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. She was a natural at this, connecting with people, building relationships, and fostering a sense of community. By midday, the market was in full swing. Live music played from a small stage at the edge of the square, and the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables wafted through the air. Amanda took a moment to step back from her booth, letting herself soak in the atmosphere. It was then that she noticed a small group of townsfolk gathered near one of the other booths, their eyes occasionally darting toward her. Their murmurs were quiet but pointed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Amanda felt a familiar pang of unease, but pushed it aside. She had come too far to let whispers and glances deter her now. As if sensing her discomfort, Henry appeared at her side. He didn't say anything, but the steady presence of his hand resting on her shoulder was enough to ground her. Amanda shot him a grateful look before turning her attention back to the booth. The day continued without incident, the success of the market evident in the smiles of the townsfolk and the empty baskets at Amanda's booth. By late afternoon, the crowd began to thin, and vendors started packing up their stalls. Amanda and Henry worked together to load the remaining produce into the back of Henry's truck. "You did good today," Henry said as they finished tying down the crates. His tone was gruff, but there was no mistaking the pride in his eyes. "Thanks, Henry," Amanda replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It feels good to see it all come together." As they drove back to the farm, the golden light of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a warm glow. Amanda leaned her head against the window, her thoughts drifting. She thought about how far she had come since that day on the haystack. The fear and uncertainty that had once consumed her had given way to hope and determination. When they reached the farm, Henry parked the truck near the barn, and they began unloading the crates. The familiar rhythm of the work was comforting, a reminder of the countless hours they had spent building this life together. As the last crate was set down, Amanda turned to Henry, her expression serious. "I've been thinking," she began, "about what's next." Henry raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I love it here," Amanda said, her voice steady. "This farm, this community, it's become home, but I think there's more I can do." Henry studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" Amanda hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to start something bigger, maybe a program to help others like me, people who've been through tough times and need a second chance. This farm could be the heart of it." Henry nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You've got the spirit for it, Amanda, and you've got my support." Amanda's smile widened, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. The air was cool and still, filled with the quiet hum of crickets. Amanda felt a sense of peace settle over her, a deep knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Here's to new beginnings," she said softly, raising a glass of iced tea. Henry raised his glass in return. "To new beginnings." As the night deepened, they sat in silence, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. The farm, once a place of solitude, had become a beacon of hope, not just for Amanda, but for the community and beyond. And while their journey was far from over, they both knew that together they could face whatever came next. And that's how a simple act of kindness changed two lives forever. What do you think of this incredible journey of hope and resilience? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more stories like this. Thank you for watching.